Everyone knows how a volcano erupts. The mountain shakes, the summit blows, and the ash goes up, upward. That is the rule. That is the picture in every textbook, every movie, every imagination on Earth. And on a quiet Sunday morning in May of 1980, in Washington State, that rule died in about 40 seconds. Because when Mount St. Helens finally let go, it did not erupt upward. The entire north face of the mountain, a wall of rock that had been swelling outward at 5 feet per day for 2 months, collapsed in the largest landslide in recorded history, and uncorked the volcano like a shaken bottle tipped on its side. The eruption fired sideways, a blast moving at hundreds of miles per hour, hugging the ground, overtaking cars on forest roads, flattening 230 square miles of full-grown forest in minutes. Trees laid flat in perfect combed rows that can still be seen from space. 57 people died that morning, including a young government scientist standing on a ridge everyone believed was safe, whose final radio call has become the most famous sentence in the history of volcanology. This is the story of the only volcanic eruption in the modern history of the United States that has killed, the morning that rewrote everything scientists thought they knew, and the reason every volcano video on this channel, Rainier, Long Valley, Yellowstone, exists in the shadow of this one mountain. This is Mount St. Helens, and it earned every minute of this video. Start in the spring of 1980, because the mountain did not sneak up on anyone. It announced itself. Mount St. Helens was the beauty of the Cascades, a nearly perfect snow-white cone, so symmetrical that people called it the Fuji of America, a postcard mountain reflected in the still water of Spirit Lake at its northern foot. It had been silent for 123 years, long enough that almost nobody alive had ever thought of it as dangerous. Then, on March 20th, a magnitude 4 earthquake rattled the mountain. Then more earthquakes, dozens, then hundreds. A week later, the summit coughed, a blast of steam and old rock punching a new crater through the ice cap. The mountain was awake, and America got to watch, because this was the first volcanic awakening of the television age in the lower 48. News crews camped on ridges. The mountain smoked on the evening news night after night. Souvenir shops printed T-shirts. Tourists drove in to see the show. Small planes circled the summit with sightseers. Scientists set up instruments on every accessible ridge, seismometers, cameras, survey targets on the swelling flank, building, without knowing it, the template for every volcano observatory that exists today. For a while, it felt less like a hazard and more like an attraction, a mountain putting on a performance. And that carnival feeling, that 2-month drumbeat of smoke without catastrophe, would prove quietly deadly, because every quiet week taught the public the wrong lesson, that the mountain was all show, that the scientists were overreacting, that the danger was a story for television. The mountain let everyone believe that, right up until 8:32 on a Sunday morning. The scientists watching it were far less entertained, because their instruments were telling them something no instrument had ever told anyone before. The north flank of the mountain was moving, not settling, not cracking, moving outward, as magma forced its way up inside the cone and jammed sideways into the mountain's structure like a fist pushing into dough. They measured it daily, and the numbers refused to be believed. The north face was swelling toward Spirit Lake at roughly 5 feet per day. Every single day, another 5 feet. By mid-May, an entire side of the mountain bulged outward by more than 450 feet, a swelling the size of a skyscraper, visibly deforming a mountain in real time. Photographs taken weeks apart look like 2 different mountains. The scientists knew exactly what it meant in general terms. The mountain could not swell forever. Something had to give. What nobody fully grasped, because it had never been watched before, was what giving would look like, and how far it would reach. Authorities drew lines on the map. A red zone, closed to the public, ringing the volcano. Roadblocks went up. Property owners were kept out, and they were furious. The mountain kept smoking, and kept not erupting. And week after week, the pressure to reopen the area grew. Cabin owners demanded access. Loggers kept working the forests just outside the lines, because the lines had been drawn as much by property maps and politics as by science, hugging the mountain far too closely on the northwest side, the exact direction the bulge was pointing. On May 17th, under pressure, officials escorted a caravan of property owners into the zone to gather belongings. Another caravan was scheduled for the next morning. The next morning was May 18th. 8:32 in the morning, Sunday, cloudless, windless. The mountain perfect against a blue sky. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck directly beneath the volcano, and the swollen north face, 450 feet out of place, shaken loose, simply let go. 2/3 of a cubic mile of mountain, the largest debris avalanche in recorded human history, slid towards Spirit Lake and the valley below, at speeds over 100 miles per hour. Part of the avalanche slammed into Spirit Lake and drove a wave of water more than 800 feet up the ridges on the far shore, stripping the slopes bare before the water sloshed back, carrying an entire drowned forest with it. Another arm of the avalanche vaulted clean over a 1,300-foot ridge and kept going. The main mass thundered 14 miles down the river valley, burying it under an average of 150 feet of shattered mountain, and with the north flank gone, the pressurized magma and superheated water inside the mountain, which that rock wall had been holding in like a cork, exploded out of the open wound, sideways, to the north. Directly along the path, the bulge had been aiming for 2 months. The lateral blast was unlike anything in American experience, a ground-hugging wave of scorching gas, ash, and shattered rock, accelerating away from the mountain at several hundred miles per hour, faster in places than the speed of sound, overtaking the landslide it followed. Within the first miles, it did not knock trees down. It removed them, stripping 100-foot firs off the land entirely. Farther out, it snapped and flattened entire forests. Millions of trees, laid down in radiating rows pointing away from the mountain. A pattern so vast and orderly, it looks combed when seen from the air. Farther still, at the blast's dying edge, it left the trees standing, but seared them dead where they stood. 230 square miles, devastated in roughly 5 minutes. People fishing and camping on ridges they believed were far beyond danger. 15 miles from the summit, were caught in it. Some survived in the shadows of ridgelines and described the same sequence. A strange silence. Then the sky going black in seconds. Then heat and wind and darkness so total they could not see their hands. Hours of it. Loggers working nearby that morning, men who knew those forests better than anyone alive, were caught among the falling trees. A young couple camped far down the Toutle River survived being swept away in the flood of logs and mud. Others walked out of the gray landscape for hours, coated in ash, unrecognizable. Many did not walk out. Of the 57 people killed that morning, nearly all were outside the official red zone. Read that sentence again, because it is the most important sentence in this story. The people who died were, with almost no exceptions, in places the government had officially left open. The lines had been wrong, and the mountain graded them in a single morning. On a ridge about 6 miles north of the summit, at an observation post called Coldwater 2, was David Johnston, 30 years old, a volcanologist with the United States Geological Survey, one of the very scientists who had argued loudest that the bulge was deadly and the zones were too small. He had the morning shift, watching the mountain, radio at hand. When the flank collapsed, Johnston keyed his radio and shouted the report that became the most famous transmission in volcanology, calling to the survey's base in Vancouver, Washington. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. The blast reached his ridge in as well under a minute. His body was never found. The observation post he manned that morning now has a successor, a permanent observatory facing the crater, and the government's entire volcano observatory for the Cascade Range. The one that watches Rainier and every mountain we have covered, carries his name. David Johnston was right about the danger. He helped keep the public farther away than politics wanted. And the science that protects the Northwest today is, in a very direct way, his memorial. And then there was Harry Truman, not the president, the 83-year-old owner of the Mount St. Helens Lodge on the shore of Spirit Lake, directly at the mountain's northern foot. Harry had lived under the mountain for over half a century, and when the evacuations came, he refused, loudly, colorfully, on every television network in America. He did not believe the mountain would ever hurt him, said he and the mountain understood each other, and he became, in those 2 months, a national folk hero. The stubborn old man, with his 16 cats and his lodge, charming reporters while the volcano smoked above him. Children wrote him letters begging him to leave. He stayed. On the morning of May 18th, the debris avalanche reached Spirit Lake in about a minute, buried the lodge site under 150 feet of shattered mountain, and rolled on. Harry Truman is still there, beneath the new land the eruption built, and Spirit Lake itself, his lake, was lifted 200 feet higher and choked with tens of thousands of blasted trees, a floating mat of logs that, astonishingly, still drifts on that lake today, more than 4 decades later. His story is told at the visitor centers, not as a warning mocked, but as something more human. The price of loving a place so much you cannot imagine it turning on you. The sideways blast was only the opening act. With the mountain's insides exposed, a vertical eruption column punched upward, 15 miles into the sky within minutes. And it did not stop for 9 hours. The cloud drifted east on the winds, and by late morning, towns 200 miles away watched a black wall swallow the horizon. Ash turned day to night across eastern Washington, streetlights on at noon, birds going silent in the false dusk, drivers stranded on highways as engines choked on the grit, towns shoveling ash like gray snowfall for days afterward. In some communities, more than 500,000 tons fell. Schools closed, airports closed. The region learned overnight the lesson we described in our Yellowstone episode, that ash is not soft, it is pulverized rock, and a fraction of an inch of it can paralyze a modern town. The cloud crossed the country in 3 days, dusting states as far away as the Great Plains, falling on windshields in Oklahoma, and circled the planet in about 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the eruption melted the mountain's glaciers, and the meltwater mixed with debris into lahars, the same liquid concrete flows we covered at Rainier, which tore down the river valleys, destroying 200 homes, taking out bridges, and dumping so much sediment into the Columbia River that the shipping channel lost most of its depth overnight, stranding ocean freighters in port. By evening, the perfect cone was gone. The summit had lost over 1,300 feet of elevation. Where the postcard peak had stood, there was a gaping horseshoe crater, open to the north, a mountain with its chest torn open. Here is the honest accounting of what that morning taught. Because the lessons are the legacy. Lesson 1, volcanoes can erupt sideways. It sounds absurd that this needed learning, but lateral blasts were simply not in the planning picture before 1980. Afterward, scientists went back through the world's volcanoes and found the scars of sideways eruptions everywhere, including, as we covered earlier in this series, in the deep past of other Cascade peaks. Every modern hazard map that draws danger zones asymmetrically, bulging farther in one direction, is a child of May 18th. Lesson 2, the bulge is the message. St. Helens proved that a deforming volcano is a loaded volcano, which is why, today, satellites and GPS measure the swelling of dangerous mountains worldwide down to fractions of an inch, and why the ground deformation numbers we cited at Long Valley and Yellowstone are watched so closely. Lesson 3, the hardest one. Nature does not respect committee lines. The red zone failed not because science failed, but because the zone was negotiated, squeezed by property and timber and politics, and drawn tighter than the scientists wanted. Nearly every death happened in land that officials had been pressured to leave open. Every scientist who has ever held a firm line against public pressure since, at Long Valley in the 80s, at every volcanic crisis since, does so carrying that fact. And the mountain was not finished teaching. In the years after the eruption, a lava dome began rising inside the crater, the mountain slowly rebuilding itself from within. Then, after a quiet spell, it erupted again in the mid-2000s. Not explosively, but extruding a new dome for over 3 years while tourists watch steam rise from the crater. And in the shadow of the crater walls, something almost poetic happened. Snow accumulated where the sun could not reach, compacted, and began to flow. A brand new glacier, the youngest glacier in the United States, growing inside the wound of the deadliest eruption in American history, wrapped around the new dome like a horseshoe. The mountain that destroyed its glaciers is growing a new one, inside its own crater. Scientists are clear about what all this rebuilding means. Street. Helens remains the most active volcano in the Cascades, the most likely to erupt again in our lifetimes. And one day, on a time scale of decades to centuries, it will rebuild toward its old profile, and the cycle will turn again. It is watched, today, more closely than any mountain in America, by the observatory that bears David Johnston's name. And life came back. This might be the most important epilogue of all. Scientists expected the blast zone to be dead for generations. A gray, sterile moonscape. Instead, within weeks, plants were pushing through the ash, fireweed first, blooming purple against the gray. Pocket gophers that had been underground during the blast surfaced and tilled the sterile surface, mixing old soil upward, becoming, absurdly, one of the most important species in the recovery. Spiders ballooned in on the wind by the millions. Elk returned within years, and their hooves punched seedbeds into the crust. Lakes reborn, some richer in life within a decade than they had been before the blast. The devastated zone became one of the most valuable natural laboratories on Earth, a live lesson in how ecosystems rebuild from nothing. And much of it was deliberately left untouched so science could watch. Drive there today, and you see it all at once. Silver logs still lying in their combed rows, young forest rising between them, the crater steaming quietly above, destruction, recovery, and threat, all in a single view. So, 3 futures, even for a mountain with a past. Future 1. The most likely in any year. The mountain rests, steams gently, grows its strange young glacier, and teaches. Millions visit. The seismometers crackle softly. Most years are this year. Future 2. The middle path. And history says a near certainty eventually. Another dome-building episode, like the mid-2000s, weeks of headlines. Spectacular and mostly harmless. The mountain adding another floor to its reconstruction. Future 3, another major explosive eruption. It has happened many times in this volcano's short, violent life. It will happen again. And when it does, the difference from 1980 will be everything around the mountain. A permanent observatory, hazard maps drawn by science instead of committees, deformation watched from orbit, and a public that remembers. The next eruption of Mount St. Helens is a certainty. The next 57 deaths are not. That difference is what those 57 bought. Here is my honest opinion. After everything the research shows, Mount St. Helens is the most important mountain in America. Not because it is the biggest threat. It is not. Rainier holds that title. But because it is the one that showed us. Every scenario in this series, every evacuation drill in the Rainier Valleys, every instrument on Long Valley, every deformation alert at Yellowstone traces back to a bulge that grew 5 feet a day while the modern world watched and did not yet have the vocabulary for what it was seeing. We paid 57 lives for that vocabulary, including one scientist who understood the danger better than almost anyone and stood his post anyway. The mountain rewrote the textbook in 40 seconds. The very least we owe that morning is to never again need the lesson twice. So now I want to hear from you. And this time, the question is different, because many of you were alive for this one. Do you remember May 18th, 1980? Where were you when St. Helens erupted? Did the ash reach your town? Did you shovel it off your car? Drop your memory in the comments? I read everyone. And for those of you too young to remember, tell me which part of this story you had never heard. If this video taught you something, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And subscribe with notifications on, because next, we go north to the most powerful earthquake in the recorded history of North America. Magnitude 9.2. The day in 1964 when the ground under an American city turned to liquid for 4.5 minutes. Neighborhoods slid into the sea. And the lessons learned? They are the only reason the West Coast has a tsunami warning system today. That story is next. The ground beneath America is speaking. Make sure you are listening.